my own teacher called this practice radical affirmation. Start in radical affirmation and go, okay, yes. Or you say to yourself, yes, I'm terrified, or I'm anxious, or I'm fearful. Say yes to that first. And then understand that the reason you're having that experience is because you need to learn something about it. That there's something more that's possible. You don't just have to be afraid. As soon as fear is disconnected from other experiences, it's no longer yoga, because yoga means making connections, making relationships. So what is that fear connected to? And what more might it be connected to so that that kind of experience can be an asset rather than a liability?
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. Thank you for making it this far for part 3 of our conversation with Professor Douglas Brooks. We're going to pick up where we left off in our previous episode and continue and conclude our conversation on the modern yogi living in the world. Here we go. I think I've actually learned that from you in the episodes of our podcast that we don't have interviews, we tell stories. And while they're definitely connected to the traditions that they come from, and we'll touch on some of the insights perhaps they have, it's always about, in essence, updating it to actually be relevant for our modern life. Because if it's a story about something in the past that happened a long time ago that we're not connecting to at all, then who cares, really? Like, it's lost all of its power to transform at that point. But if we can draw meaning from it in our lives, then it's actually re-empowered, and it's empowering us to learn from it and to grow from it. And
good for you. And I much commend this, because in addition to the stories, the power of interpretation is the much more difficult art. And part of that goes back to our initial conversation. It's going to take some time, not only to learn the stories, but to be able to piece them together in ways that give us a richer and more valent sense of interpretation and capacity. It's one of those, I'll give you a simple example. Like this semester at the university, I'm finally kind of fulfilling a deep desire of my entire teaching career. I'm teaching the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana in one semester. Now, yes, that's insane and ambitious, and the goal is not to be superficial. We have 15 weeks to study the 4 great epics of two of the great epic cultures, right? The Greeks and the Indians. And the irony of the class is that you would learn so much more if you had already spent 40 years reading all 4 texts.
Right.
Because then you could really get down to the process of comparison and really learning from the stories comparatively. Because the wonderful part about this class is that, Achilles is not Arjuna. He is not Yudhishthira. Rama is much like Odysseus as a wandering man, but is not Odysseus. And to be able to draw out the depth and the value of each of those stories is a kind of invitation to know all of those stories. So the first things I so commend these podcasts, because the more encyclopedic, the more curious and endeavoring yogis are, the greater their perspective can become. Because this task of learning mythically about the richness of the non-rational consciousness, or accessing more of ourselves, let's just put it that way, is a milky ocean. It's an ocean. It's an enormity of human possibilities and of storytelling traditions. And the more you know, the more fun you're going to have. Mm-hmm. That's always been my claim. Hang in there. The first thing I say to my own students is, this could take some time. And if you like, come back tomorrow, because your curiosity will be rewarded with a depth and a sensibility of the richness that comes from your willingness to commit to this vast ocean. of learning. And that's going to take commitment and time. And that of course seems kind of, antithetical to our modern yogi condition. We're busy, we're driven by, we surf the web, everything is reduced to a tweet. Everything's 140 characters. I can kind of get with that as a sutra, but maybe we need to really endeavor to think about that. The reason ancient India wrote in these pithy, laconic forms, these aphorisms, these tweets. A sutra is a tweet. That's not fully. And the question is, well, how much did that prompt? What did that lead you to? How many connections can you make? Yoga is making the depth of connection and seeing more and more. How is this like that? How is this not like that? Why is Agamemnon the king like Rama the king? And why is he not? How do these stories tell us about ourselves? What difference do these differences make as we draw out meaningful boundaries and invite ourselves to the depths of the human condition? So what I'm asking us is, what do we share as humans? And so we can cross history and culture and time and endeavor in these teachings and endeavor into these cross-cultural comparisons. And yet, at the same time, how is this relevant and peculiar to me? What does this tell me about myself as a sentient living being of the 21st century? I think yoga's got room for both of those. But it's not going to be easy if we really want to learn. I think the modern yogi is also being pressured by the mainstreaming of yoga. Yoga is becoming more and more, don't mistake me when I say this, but let me just reduce it, stretching in Sanskrit, or even stretching without Sanskrit, or that it's just a wellness tradition that you can assign to yourself at the gym along with spinning or something else. That puts a lot of pressure on the word yoga. Is that what it means? Does it mean that, does it mean what happens on the mat? Is yoga modern postural exercise? What more yoga can be? I think we're actually starting to lose that as yoga mainstreams and really becomes just much more simply, decidedly used as a word to describe the phenomena of asana practice, what we would call asana practice. There are a lot of people who are practicing asana who don't even call it asana anymore. Because that's too exotic a word. That's too far down the path of yoga. And yet yoga, the role of asana historically in yoga is, as anyone with a historical or background would know, is at best marginal, ancillary, supportive, and probably likely unimportant to the larger questions that yoga is asking, because yoga is asking the really great question. That is, how deeply are you willing to engage your experience? And then how to do that.
Well, and I think that's part of the benefit for our modern Western person, in that we're so disembodied, we're so in our heads, that I think that's kind of why the prevalence of postural practice has come in, because it gives them that opportunity to go inside deeper into their own bodily experience, which they're usually discouraged from doing. But as you're saying, like it can't stop there. And that's where, unfortunately, it seems like there's a bunch of roadblocks there, people trying to get it to stop there versus expand it into the deeper traditions and deeper into the other possibilities of interaction and exploration and depth.
But let me pose the opposite as well. That is, if we reduce ourselves to, well, I feel this way, then we're in a post-factual world. Then something like the current political cycle overtakes us because we're unwilling to call out the facts and use our heads, not just our bodies and our minds. So I'm agreeing with you that our contemporary life is heady and disconnected and somatically destructive. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They walked every day. They got some exercise. They ate more naturally. The world goes, and they did things that were more connective to physicality. Again, ironically, in the Indian tradition, there's a deeply antagonistic, ambiguous, strange relationship with the body in the history of yoga. Let's not fool ourselves. There are many places in the yoga traditions, Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, and elsewhere, that call the human body a sack of piss and shit. Okay, quite literally, that's exactly what the text says. And yet, this is what we got, and it's all we got. And so the yoga traditions weren't antagonistic to facts and using our minds and sussing out the complications of the human world. With all of our available resources. They weren't entirely commending the body and its feeling. They were also ambiguous and realistic about its limitations and maybe about its vulgarities. What I'm saying is that yoga has meant to take a more comprehensive sense of the experience of being human. And I'm agreeing with you that our modern lives kind of stick us in a chair and leave us in our heads. I'm a prime example of that in a certain way. I mean, you've asked me about books and articles and other things I've accomplished. The more my sorry ass sits in one place, the more accomplished I am, right? And yet, how good is that for me as a person and as a human body and the rest of it? On the other hand, if all I have are my feelings, then nothing matters anymore. Then Trump can say anything. And it just doesn't matter because, well, I feel that way. Well, what about reality? What about the facts? What about the assessments that we really need to make that are serious and hard and maybe unpleasant or maybe helpful?
Well, that's another whitewashing that you see a lot in yoga communities. It's like, well, these are my feelings, and my feelings are authentic and they're real, and so I must honor them. It's like, no, your feelings are determined by biochemical processes and some scars.
Let's validate your feelings, but are they sound? Let's make that old distinction.
Yeah, they're authentic, but
valid is saying you're having them. Yeah. Sound is saying, okay, now how do they map on to other people's thoughts and feelings? Mm-hmm. How has that not become, think of it when we often enter a contemporary conversation or even a yoga conversation, it ends with, that's my opinion. This is a conversation stopper because all I'm supposed to do is validate your opinion. Well, how about we reach beyond ourselves and map our opinions onto other people's opinions and then onto facts, because those are real. Yoga traditions don't start with the idea. They start with the facts. You're a human body. You're mortal, limited, and conditioned. And by the way, the more you think about dying, the more you might love living. Those are all parts of the realities of the yoga world, taking the world seriously and taking life as also fun and joyful. I mean, the task of learning, I think what's so problematic, especially in our own Western culture, is that we've also lived in the meme that being learned or being contemplative or being scholarly is somehow being removed from the world. Like we've diminished the educator and the process of education. And that's because so many people didn't have any fun learning. They didn't have someone who inspired, someone who could make them realize that laughing is part of learning, that a good joke is better than is the best way into a serious thought. I mean, yeah, I'm confessing that I'm a failed stand-up or sit-down comic, but I think that it's crucial that if modern yoga is going to go forward, we become integrative and inclusive of all of our resources. We don't go, the West failed and India has something to offer. Absolutely. We become inclusive of all the kinds of learning we have available. And then we actually endeavor to understand that practicing asana is learning about your body and your feelings, just like reading a serious article is all about mantra, for example, would be an important part of those strategies of self-development. Now, let me add one more thing. We can really make this fun and interesting, but do notice that as the great Spinoza, the Portuguese philosopher, well, he was Dutch, but he was the Jewish philosopher, once said, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. And Spinoza was admitting that a lot of what's really good about life is tedious, torturous, and relentless, like being a parent, for example. I don't know. If you wake up every morning and go, man, I just really love changing that diaper, I think you're delusional. All right. But I do think that it's worth it. Mm-hmm. And I think that the great question of yoga goes beyond success and failure, because success and failure means you did it or you didn't do it. Like you got to yoga class today or you didn't. Like it's zeros and ones. But greatness, maha, the magnificent, the magma, those are all related words that tell us that are all related to the word greatness. Greatness asks a different question. It says, is this really worth it? Is it worth your time, your energy, your effort to go to a yoga class? Like you have to get your sorry self up and out. Is it really worth, turning off the internet or separating the sheep from the goats, like reading a difficult article about mantra rather than some more soporific tripe? Because this thing about being human is it worth it? And the things that are really worth it, they're going to tax you. They're going to take their cost. They're going to be demanding. And yoga has always, that's what the word tapas in yoga means. It doesn't mean austerity or giving up. It means demanding. It means it's going to heat you up. It's going to require a kind of temerity, a real sense of getting in there and doing the work. And you'll notice that this isn't simply a problem among our modern yogis. This is just the human condition. Again, I'm not just blowing smoke, but you've made a great effort to being a voice that communicates with real people, that reaches into classes and podcasts, become an extension of the educational community. I really commend that. I also commend the idea that maybe you phoned me up, because I've spent my last 40 years doing the only thing I know how to do, which is study this subject. And so we have to turn to each other. I need to turn to you because you're a communicator who reaches a lot of people. But I also suggest the yoga community has to want what those who've done the hard work have to offer, and be wary of the charlatans. The yoga traditions are really careful about that. They're really quick to not only assign, greatness to a teacher or gurudom to a teacher, which again, a term I'm very suspicious of, but also to point out, you could easily be manipulated or duped here. And the number of charlatans outnumbers the real deal by an internet to one ratio. Be careful. It's always been a dangerous, precarious world filled with snake oil. And I love my snake oil. That is, I love the idea that the difficult task requires us to use our venom sparingly so that we can be protective and we can be digestive and we can take care of ourselves using the resources we have. That's a great story my teacher always told about the nagas, about the serpents, the maligned and misbegotten snakes who hold this fantastic place in yoga storytelling. I'd love to tell snake stories for an hour with you.
Well, maybe we'll get you back for that sometime.
Yeah, the snakes have venom, and of course the venom scares others, and everyone thinks that it's poison. But one of the things you learn about that is that they use it to protect themselves. That's an important part of any living being's story. How do we protect ourselves from a world that's dangerous and precarious and threatening and predatory? And they use it to digest their food, right? The best way to kill a cobra is defang it and put it in a basket, because it'll starve to death. Mm-hmm. So similarly, we need our own venom used sparingly for those really great reasons we might have it, that we might be possessed of these resources. Similarly, fear or anger. I'm the last one to tell you, don't be fearful. If you're standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon looking down, a healthy, managed experience of fear would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about your perspective and insight, because, having grown up with a relationship to spiritual traditions most of my life from a very young age, most of them are so caught up on the transcendent. And when I was living in Asia and wanting to kind of go off into a cave and do that whole thing, it was that same mindset. And it was teachers like yourself that, and like my sensei was always challenging me to be like, be in the world. And if you can't integrate those experiences, then you haven't really attained anything anyways. And I love...
Well, you managed to say that in a very wonderful way, because I think that the traditions that I think we have a great deal to learn in Indian yoga from Zen. Do remember that, because you used the word sensei, which of course is the Japanese term, which is essentially substituting for the word guru. The word Zen is let's say this charitably and tongue-in-cheek, but this also happens to be true. Zen is the mispronunciation of the Chinese word Chan, which is the mispronunciation of the Sanskrit word dhyana, which is the mispronunciation of the Prakrit or Pali word jhana. So this is a story of transmission and historical telephone. And yet, I would suggest that my own Rajanika tradition, which is South Indian, Nataraja, and the Shiva traditions are at the heart of it. The goddess is at the heart of it in the form of these complicated stories that are called Sri Vidya, is also very much a Zen tradition, because my teacher's fundamental teaching was chop wood, fetch water. The hardest thing to do is eat when you're hungry and sleep when you're tired. That is, address foremost the condition of our humanity, and we open the gateways to what more is possible. My own teacher called this practice radical affirmation. And start in a world where we just ascend. Again, it's like when someone says, well, that's my belief or that's my opinion. Start in radical affirmation and go, okay, yes. Or you say to yourself, yes, I'm terrified, or I'm anxious, or I'm fearful. Say yes to that first. And then understand that the reason you're having that experience is because you need to learn something about it. That there's something more that's possible. You don't just have to be afraid. As soon as fear is disconnected from other experiences, it's no longer yoga, because yoga means making connections, making relationships. So what is that fear connected to? And what more might it be connected to so that that kind of experience can be an asset rather than a liability? There you go. Now you're making yoga because you're seeing things with a richer perspective and a larger sense of contiguity and relationship, trying to put things together in bigger patterns. Then I think modern yoga has a chance. And that's really, it's not a solution for our human condition, but it's a way to talk about modernity, because we are really all connected. Like, unless we get a global climate accord, this planet will burn. Human beings will not survive. Unless we take seriously the extinction of species, we are going to extinguish ourselves. We are globally, entirely connected to one another. In that sense, modernity holds out the true promise of yoga. Well, how are we connected? Where can we agree? How do we have to create accords? And what is the role of coercion? Like, how do we make people agree who won't? Those are all real things in the world.
Well, and I love the perspective of, like, there's a social component to the experience of yoga, that it's not just about doing your own thing off in a cave somewhere, but now it's like entering into that conversation and that connection with others to really create the world that we choose to live in. We don't need to glorify it as this is the right world or the wrong world even, but just to say, like, hey, this is the world that we're collectively coming together to create. And that's part of our yogic process.
The yoga tradition sort of has only itself to blame for some of that sense of accomplishment in isolation or radical autonomy that kind of leads you down the path of asceticism. Early Patanjali yoga, and the word is carried on through Advaita Vedanta, through Shankara. The word kaivalya, or kevala, the state of kaivalya. Well, that word actually means onlyness. That is, and it's a word that is not improperly translated, a sense of isolation. That is, something that is distinguished from other things in the way in which it becomes impervious or immaculate or untainted by some other entrammlement, some other unwanted association. That's a deeply problematic idea. That's, again, it's permeated the conversations of modern yoga precisely because of the way we inherited contemporary yoga in the West. Like, who were those voices? A lot of that is strange, serendipitous history, like who told us what. But the tradition of the isolated, cave-dwelling ascetic is hard bitten in the West as a kind of model of yoga. A lot of it because we learned that from the people who first gave us that. And then even if we turn to traditions that say the world is real or invite us back to householdership, there are very few places where that invitation to the messy, problematic, interesting stuff about being mortal is really included in the process. Even in, for example, the fascinating traditions that let's characterize them by the term Kashmir Shaivism, that really refers to a lot of different traditions and practices. Even those folks are really telling us, well, there is this supreme state that exempts you from the world, and then there's the world. And you can continue to experience the world in a worldly way, but in a certain sense, you get a pass when you ultimately, access ultimacy, when you arrive at this para, this supreme. I think it's actually the other way around, that as Zen once again tells us, imperfection is perfection. The world is all that is the case. That would be my teacher's way of looking at it. And so that if you want to use a word like the supreme or the ultimate para, you're really talking about the integration of a complete human experience. Like, keeping it real is really the thing I would urge modern yogis, more than all things, to consider. Like, what does that really mean? Like, let's keep it real. Like, let's be really honest and not tell ourselves some consolation. Not give ourselves some story that goes, well, in the end, it's all going to be okay. Yeah. Or what does that mean? I'm much more interested in that process. And that process is, may include an awful lot that's real, that's lost. Mm-hmm. Who among us hasn't lost someone we truly love? Well, you can say, well, she or he is in a better place. For my taste, I have no idea what that means. Mm-hmm. What I will say is that they're in my heart, and that their loss is real to me, and that informs the richness and the complexity of a life that includes loss. Mm-hmm. So there we have it. I mean, are we willing to do the hard work rather than tell ourselves the easier story, that there's a place in a cave we can go where it's all going to be okay?
Right. So, Douglas, just to jump in a little bit, I honestly could probably sit here all day with you on end and continue to have these conversations. I know you're also a little infamous for diving down the rabbit holes, which is something I'm more than happy to do all the time. But I do want to respect your time and the time that we have, which we've already extended quite a bit already. If we could just kind of close with, if for the yogi that's, the average yogi coming into a yoga class, an asana class, they're wanting to dive deeper. I know you personally have a lot of offerings. You have online courses. You have a few books. What step could you recommend to that yogi who wants to explore the possibilities that you're talking about, and that the traditions have that go beyond most of what people are getting in their typical yoga class? Like, what would be just one step to take, whether it's a course or a book or a teacher or whatever it is? Like, can you recommend a direction for people that want to explore a little bit more?
Sure. Let me start out by saying thank you for that rabbit hole suggestion. The great Indian philosopher Bhartrhari, one of the great linguistic philosophers of the 4th century, once described the universe as a run-on sentence. I really love that. But if I would make any suggestion to someone who's just getting into yoga or is doing asana and wants to learn more, my first suggestion would be to prioritize some time. to make a commitment to time, the time you spend in asana, and then say to yourself, well, if I want to learn more about yoga, this is going to take some time. So do I have 3 hours a week? Because we have to make that commitment first. We have to prioritize our lives because it really is mortality. And what we are doing with our time is going to make all the difference. Then, if we have that commitment to time, use some of that time that you've really scrupulously decided is for your enrichment, for your betterment, for your learning about yoga, to find out who knows something, who can really help you, who has had the experience and the education, who has access to the languages, to the sources, who has access to the materials, and then be honest about studying time itself, studying history, studying those sources and looking at courses or books and entering into conversations. Maybe the first thing to do in that commitment you make to yourself to time is to find a colleague, to find a cohort, find a community, find folks who will similarly make that time. Someone you can do it with. Enter into a conversation. Yoga will happen when you commit yourself to a conversation. And literally converse. That is with turns, with verses. Atha Yoga Anushasanam, let us study together that project of yoga. And when to do it? Well, now. So the urgency of now is the commitment you make to yourself to carve out that time. Mm-hmm. Try to enter a conversation. Try to find a community where that process of storytelling is taken seriously and where you can admit many different kinds of voices and diverse opinions. But you also understand that your education is at stake, that you want to constantly up the ante. How do you do that? Well, yeah, I've got plenty of courses online, and there are other really serious and genuine folks in the world who will help you learn, like you. But commit yourself, enter a conversation, and find someone whose time is worth it to you.
And where can people find you and study with you more? Website, all that sort of stuff.
Well, I've got we have a website called rajanaka.com, rajanaka.com. On that website, you'll find a seminar schedule that extends over this year. I'm on the road almost every weekend. And that all emerged, let me say, that all happened because people have asked me. I came sort of out of a very private spiritual life and an academic life, which is, almost always self-contained and insular, and into the world of teaching yogis because my friends asked me, will you teach me? Will you learn? We have online courses. You can write to me directly at an email address, svcourses@gmail.com, or go to that rajanaka.com website and just click on info. If you click on info, you'll reach one of the phones are waiting. Operators are there. What it is it's with me. And I can help you and direct you. There's a million ways to learn. There are seminars. There's a trip we run as pilgrims to India, to South India each year. There's online courses which are rich and worth every dime. Everything, I think, has a cost. And let me say one last thing to modern yogis. Nothing in life really is free. Everything comes at a cost. So even if someone is offering you something generously, it will come at the cost of your time and efforts. But don't diminish the value of things. Things that are really worth it are worth it. Mm-hmm. Our courses are. I'll give you a great discount if you mention the podcast here.
Oh, all right. We'll put that in the description too.
That'd be really swell. I'd be happy to do that. All of the proceeds from the SB courses, from the online courses that I can deliver to you as MP3 files, all of those proceeds go back to India, go back to our courses, so the courses are for payback. We're giving charitably to schools, temples, priests, and individuals in India who I think are part of the greater educational process. You can also find me on Yoga Glow, which I think is a fantastic way to get an education for $18 a month. I love Yoga Glow that way, especially for more advanced learning. And all of those Yoga Glow classes that I offer are serious, and they're in chunks. They're in little bits. They're in bite size, 15, 30, 60 minutes. Mm-hmm. So write to me, send me an email. I'll write back to you. Thank you so much, Ashton, for the access and for the conversation. It's really fun.
Absolutely. Thank you, Douglas. I really appreciate the conversation very much. I appreciate you. I want to give our listeners my personal endorsement of your courses online as well, which I've taken a number of, and they're extremely high quality. That's what has caused this interaction, but this is what inspired, our interactions is I got to learn from you, first from old CDs that you had published that I was listening to when I was living in Asia, and then eventually got the online courses going. So I've been able to interact with you and learn from you for a number of years, even before we ever connected personally. So I really appreciate the quality of the work that you have up there and the insight. So I really encourage listeners to go check it out. You have a lot of really awesome stuff out there.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say, thank you, folks. The yoga community has been a lifeline to a greater conversation that goes far beyond academics for me. That's enriching and wonderful for me personally. Just to talk to someone like you is a great boon in my life. It's a great gift. It's why I really entered this world. I became a college professor and academic because I wanted to learn, but also, outside the academic community has become an important part of my life personally and wonderfully, just to meet folks who are curious and who want to learn. And also just to say, I really am committed at this point in my life. I'm in my 60th year here, and I really very much want to give back. I want to give back to the India that gave me a beautiful life, and I'd like to connect with people who want to learn and give back something from the great opportunity that I was given. I was just a really lucky kid who decided to dive in and stay in that ocean. And I want to thank you and thank folks for giving me that chance. And to say, the resources that come back and forth between us serve us all. And I mean to make them part of giving back to India and giving back in some sense to the yoga community that's given me so much. Thanks a million.
Well, I appreciate you so much, Douglas. Thank you. And for our listeners out there, thank you for joining our conversation today. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savana Podcast. To find out more about Savana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Savana on Facebook at facebook.com/Savana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savana Podcast.